Hi, and welcome to Parashat Mattot. And in this parasha, we have the laws of vows and oaths, the battle against the Midianites, the rebuke of the officers, the koshering of utensils, the division of all the spoils, and finally the whole story of Reuven and Gad wanting to stay in the east side of the bank, of the West Bank. So let's start with the whole idea of vows and oaths, and why is this brought here? Lord Jonathan Sacks states that it's brought here after all the descriptions of the korbanot at the end of Pinchas for the festivals. Now we have the description of the voluntary korbanot of vows. But the Alshech says that the whole idea as vows is something is not encouraged by the Torah. And the reason is that we only make vows, he says, when we are in a state of anger or unbalanced mind. And he says that there are two reasons that warrants making a vow. And the first is if you forbid yourself something that is permissible generally in order to reinforce your ability to resist the temptation to go there or to do that thing. That's the first case. The second case is if you forbid something to yourself that is already forbidden by the Torah, and you're just using the vow as a way to reinforce your battle against the Yetzer Hara. And although the Torah acknowledges the sincerity of the sentiment of and motivation for making a vow, it kind of deplores the use of vows and feels that we should be able to stick to our word without relying on the crutch of the mechanism of the vow. And it's interesting to note again, Rabbi Johnson Sacks mentioned that it is the very ability to make a vow, to promise, to say something that you're going to keep in the future that binds the human society and allows the possibility of freedom that only happens when you can trust in a person's word. And therefore, it's something that should be very highly protected. And the ability to promise something and keep to it is how we express our being in the image of God. And now let's turn to the fascinating story of the war against the Midianites. And in chapter 32, verse 1, this double notion of nekom nikmat, you should surely take revenge. And it talks about a revenge against revenge for Hashem in verse 2 and revenge for the Bnei Israel in verse 3. The other peculiarities about this is that only 1,000 people from each of the 12 tribes is volunteered to fight this war, which is very bizarre, very different to any other war that was fought. Also, the need for Pinchas to be there present. What is he doing there? What's the purpose of him being there? And finally, most peculiar of all is the fact that Moshe's death is linked with this final call for him to action, which is to fight the war against Midian. Let's try to understand what's going on there. And the Alshech quotes Bamidbar Rabbah 22:3 that says that the people didn't want to fight this war because they realized that the conclusion of it would mean the coming of Moshe's death. And so they had to be volunteered. And as we said before in the previous parasha, there were two sins that happened at Shittim. The first is the Moabite women seduced the common people, and the second is that the Midianite women attempted to seduce the elite of the Israeli society. And the Alshech says there are two types of enemies of the Jewish people. The first are the ones that want to kill us physically, and their examples of those are Edom and Egypt. And you have Pesukim confirming that. For example, Exodus chapter 15, verse 9, it says, and I will unleash my sword. This is the Egyptians talking. And then with regards to Edom, in Bamidbar 22, verse 18, Edom says to him, you shall not pass through me, lest I come against you with my sword. Both clearly looking to a physical killing of the Bnei Israel. But the second type of enemy of Israel is the one that wants to kill us spiritually. And Moab is an example of that. And it is for this reason we're told not to hate Edom or Egypt, but with regards to Moabite, they're not allowed to become members of the Jewish people. And with regards to Midianites, they actually waged a spiritual war against us. And it is for this reason that Hashem commanded Moshe to wage a spiritual war against them. And that's why we have this dual expression of revenge for Hashem and revenge for the children of Israel. And what's fascinating for me is the realization this year when I'm reading it, that there were the three leaders of Bnei Israel were the ones that were most connected with Midianite women. Moshe was married to a Midianite woman, and so was Elazar the Kohen, Agadol. And Pinchas, the son of Elazar, was effectively the grandchild of Yitro. All of these leaders had connections with Midianites, and so the Alshech is saying that they were the very people that should have stood up to the Bnei Israel and explained to them that inappropriate connection with Midianite women was not acceptable in God's eyes. Now, Elazar couldn't do what Pinchas did because he was a Kohen Gadol, and if he killed, then the defilement of the met of the dead will be upon him, and the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to do that. So he was kind of exempt from that. Moshe, on the other hand, should have stood up and did what Pinchas did, but for some reason he was hesitant and inactive, and therefore he came upon Pinchas to actually do the deed. And remember that when he did it, it was before he was a Kohen Gadol, Kohen rather, so he was allowed to to come in defilement with dead for the purpose of Kiddush Hashem. And so we are faced in this parasha with the fact that Moshe still has to fix his inaction at the time of the incident of Cosbi and Zimri. And for this, God invites him to lead the attack against the Midianites as a repair, a fixing of that missed opportunity. And this is the last action, as it were, for Moshe to do. And it was important that this battle happened before he passed away, because God didn't want the Midianites to have a claim that had Moshe been alive, he would never have consented to such a cruel war against the Midianite, as can be seen by his inactivity during Zimri and Cosbi's incident. And so to dispel that, it was important that Moshe himself organized this war against the Midianite. And it was particularly interesting that in verse 16 we see Moshe very angry with the captains of the army who failed to kill all the Midianite women who were involved with seducing the Jewish people. And in verse 2, God promises Moshe that once he undertakes this task, Moshe will be able to enter paradise and to be gathered by his people. And this is clearly not a normal war. We can see that there was not a single casualty amongst the Israelites, which is incredible. Not only that, the big lesson from Moshe to the people was that the Midianites managed to kill 24,000 Jewish people without lifting a single sword. Such was the lethal power of this sin. And so Moshe wanted to show and demonstrate that he could completely destroy the Midianite army with half that number, namely 12,000 Jewish soldiers. And the fact that there was no loss in the Jewish camp showed that this was a war between pure and impure. And so to succeed in this spiritual war, Moshe had to recruit the finest men from each tribe, the men that were free of sin and morally superior. And that's why it says in verse 3, "Vayihiyu al Midian," they will be on the Midianites. In other words, they didn't actually wage war, they just presented themselves in their formation, and that was enough to disintegrate the Midianite army. And the Alshech is suggesting that it's the angels that were created by the good deeds of these holy, righteous men in the Jewish camp that actually did the fighting for the Bnei Israel and destroyed the Midianite army. And if we recall a few parashas before, we were talking about how the angels who were originally holding the Merkavah, the abode of the sanctity of the Shekhinah, became the army of the Jewish people. And at the time I wasn't quite sure what that meant, and I can see here what that meant in fact. And the description of the recruiting is 1,000 men for each tribe, as opposed to from each tribe. The Alshech says that this means that even those staying behind were very much part of the victory of Bnei Israel. And everybody was equal partners in performing this mitzvah. And this was very different from the war that Joshua fought against the Amalek back in Exodus chapter 17 verse 9, which was very much a physical war. And in the same way that Pinchas was not afraid to die in his zealous act, none of the 12,000 men were afraid to die. And if that's the case, what is Pinchas doing there? What's his role? And the Midrash Tanchumas says that Pinchas, as a Kohen, was wearing the tzitz, and it was a tzitz that enabled Bilam to be vanquished in this battle. And again, this phrase in verse 7, Voews al Midian, they warred with Midian. It's an expression of the fact that they massed. It wasn't a physical battle, but a presence that created the success of the battle against the Midianites. Our battle formation completely demoralized the Midianite men. But if they're so righteous, why do we have in verse 48, chapter 31, that the officers approached Moshe and wanted to offer a sacrifice of atonement to Hashem? What had they done wrong that they needed to atone for? And in verse 50, it says that they found jewelry that was worn by the Midianite women, and what they were atoning for, any forbidden fantasies that the officers might have indulged in. And now let's turn to the final story of Reuven and Gad wanting to stay in the east side of the Jordon River and not to cross across to mainline Israel. And the Alshech points out that this whole parasha starts with the letter Vav, V, and it's an indication that it's linked with the previous chapter. What's the link with it? And why all of a sudden Reuven and Gad are asking this request? Why now? We know that the allocation of the land of Israel was going to be done by lottery. So what kind of chutzpah is it that you would say, I actually want this piece of land? What drove Reuven and Gad to say that? And how dare they say that they're not going to go across the Jordan and fight the war against the Canaanites? And most peculiarly, in verse 8, we see Moshe bringing the story of the spies to reprimand the tribes of Reuven and Gad. What's the connection between the sin of the spies and what Reuven and Gad are doing? So the Alshech says the whole reason that this came up is that because in the previous chapter we talked about the allocating of the spoils of the war against Midianites, which had huge cattle and sheep. And Reuven and Gad were already full with cattle and sheep, and their extra allocation as a result of the war meant that they were overflowing. That's why the two descriptions. In verse 1 it says Rav, and it also says Atzum, many and powerful were their livestock. And it's this acknowledgement when they had to count all the sheep that made them, and livestock made them understand and realize that they needed the appropriate land to be able to graze all these animals. And that's what activated this request at this moment in time. And this was the argument that Gad made forward, and that if they were totally left to the lottery, they might get land that was totally inappropriate for the cattle that they had. Moreover, they said God wouldn't have made this war against the Midianites if he didn't want it to become part of the greater Israel. Otherwise, they would have just entered in through a narrow corridor rather than conquering the whole land. And also in this parcel of land was Nevo, which is where Moshe's burial grave would be. And they said, we want to honor that. And they said, we want to treasure the ground that Moshe is going to be buried at, which is the other reason why we want to stay in the East Bank. And they appealed to the leaders of the other tribes by saying that if you give us the East Bank, then there'll be more for you guys to share from the mainland of Israel. And with regards to not crossing the Jordan, they said quite interestingly that, as you can see from the war with the Midianites, it wasn't a normal war. It's a war that God fought on our behalf. We just have to be present, and God does the fighting for us. So what do you need us for? And Moshe actually agreed with their thought process, but not with regards to the fact that they weren't going to cross into the Jordan. And Moshe brought through the example of the spies to indicate how important, how crucial the moral support of being with your brothers had on the outcome of the war to be fought with the Canaanites. And Moshe said if there was a problem with the actual war against the Canaanites itself, Gad and Reuven wouldn't be able to cope with the guilt of not being present in helping their brothers. And Moshe suggested that the fallout of the results of the spies had not yet been completed, and this action by Reuven and Gad would have flared up God's anger in an instant. And we see that their approach in verse 16 is different from that in the beginning, verse 2. Here they're approaching Moshe and they want to articulate to him that they are not afraid of going in and fighting the war in the west bank of the Jordan. They simply wanted time and the ability to leave men behind to protect and to build cities for their children and for their livestock. And the reason that they mentioned livestock before their children was to indicate to Moshe that they were not afraid of leaving their children so that they can go and fight the war. So the comment, don't let us across Jordan, it only meant don't let us cross now until we had time to build the pens for our livestock and our children. And Moshe says, okay, but build the security structure for your children before you build it for your livestock. And it's interesting that in verse 25 it says Vayomar in the singular. In other words, the tribes all unanimously agreed to Moshe's proposal. And so a few of them were left behind to protect the children and the livestock, and the selected zealots would go into the land and fight the battle together with their brothers until all of Israel was conquered, which took some 12 years after. And we see in Joshua chapter 1 verses 14 and 15 the reference to Gevorei HaChayil, the strong elite of these 2.5 tribes that fought the war. And once Moshe verified the intent of the 2.5 tribes, he actually commanded Eleazar and Joshua not to harass them for the decision to stay on the east side of the bank. But he did say that the west side would still be allocated by lottery to all 12 tribes. And it's interesting to note that in verse 32, it says nachnu instead of anachnu. Whenever it says nachnu, it means not the complete group. So again, an indication that the elite of Reuven, Gad, and Manasseh went across to fight in conquering the land of Israel. And that's it for the Parashat Mattot, and some beautiful ideas here. I want to leave you with an amazing bracha that we see that God invites Moshe to fix the error that he did with the Midianites, to allow him to go into Gan Eden, to paradise after that. And so my blessing to you is that we should use 120 years, please God, that we have in this world to fix everything that we needed to fix, so that when we go to Olam Haba, we are all the doors will be wide open for us, and we'll be welcomed with open arms. God bless. Shabbat Shalom. See you next week.